Well, we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Dee Dee Ruggles. I'm director of the Unit for Criticism and Interpretive Theory. Welcome to the Modern Critical Theory Lecture Series, which happens in the fall semester every Tuesday night in this room at 5:15, with just one wonderful lecture after another. Masks are, of course, not obligatory, but we do bring them and we do encourage you to wear them. My daughter has COVID. 3 of my colleagues have COVID. It seems to be on the rise. I don't like wearing masks, but I'm going to be wearing mine just because, I don't want to get COVID. Anyway, so if you want one, there's one there. And I'd also like to begin with the land acknowledgement, our customary land acknowledgement, which is a reminder that we are on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascouten, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. Lands that were the traditional territory of Native nations prior to their forced removal. The land continues to carry the stories of those nations and their struggles for survival and identity. As a land grant institution in particular, the University of Illinois has a particular responsibility to acknowledge the peoples of these lands, as well as the histories of dispossession that have allowed for the growth of this same institution for the past 150 years. So over the next 150 years, we must strive to become a vibrant community, inclusive of our differences, with Native peoples at the core of our efforts. Before introducing tonight's speaker, I want to remind you that the MCT next week will be on the theme of labor, and our speaker will be Cheryl Yang from Washington University, Department of English. But tonight, we have the pleasure of hearing from Helmut Puff, the Elizabeth L. Eisenstein Collegiate Professor of History and Germanic Languages at the University of Michigan. Additionally, Professor Puff holds appointments in women's studies, history of art, and anthropology. And when you hear the lecture, I think you'll understand certainly the history of art part of it, and maybe the anthropology part of it too, because it's about behavior. Helmut Puff's teaching and research focus on German literature, history, and culture in the late medieval and early modern period. He specializes in gender studies, the history of sexuality, media history, the history of reading and the book, and the literature of the Reformation and the Renaissance. His authored books are Von den Schlüssel aller Künsten, which translates, and I always love reading German titles because I have actually no experience with German whatsoever, so it's kind of like a performance for me. I like it. It translates to On the Key to All Arts, and namely grammar, German language in Latin textbooks. That was published a long time ago, 1995. That was your first book. Yeah. That was followed by Sodomy in Reformation Germany and Switzerland, 1400 to 1600. That was published in 2003. Next came Miniature Monuments, Modeling German History, co-authored with Helmut Puff, Ulrike Strasser, and Christopher Wilde. That was in 2014. And then Waiting in the Antechamber, the book that we will hear about tonight that will shortly be in print. In fact, it is in print. It's just awaiting distribution from Stanford University Press. In addition to those authored volumes, our speaker has also edited and co-edited numerous volumes. The first being Zwischen den Disziplinen, Perspectives on Interdisciplinarity in Early Modern Studies, co-edited with Christopher Wilde. That was in 2003. And After the History of Sexuality, German Genealogies with and Beyond Foucault. That was co-edited with Scott Spector and Dagmar Herzog in 2012. And Cultures of Communication, Theology of Media in Early Modern Europe and Beyond, which was co-edited with Ulrike Strasser and Christopher Wilde in 2017. In a long list of honors, I will simply mention that he was recently a fellow at the National Humanities Center in North Carolina and has held honorary professorial appointments at numerous universities, including as professeur invité at the École des Hautes Études, Social Sciences in Paris. So we're delighted that you are here today with us. Very much looking forward to this topic, a topic that's actually near and dear to my heart since I'm architectural history. And with that, please welcome our speaker, and you have the floor.
So, thank you so very much for this kind introduction. I'm fearing that I need... It's on? Okay. Sorry, I've never been in the position of having two microphones. So I need to check this one is not. And so let me thank you again for this lovely introduction, Didi, and for the invitation, which sort of goes back to a communication that I had with Harriet Muraf, and that I'm so wonderfully surprised to be here as a result of that exchange. I also want to thank everyone who's made this visit possible, especially Taisuke Wakabayashi, who has been wonderful to work with. So, time matters. I had to get up very early this morning to come to Urbana-Champaign, and should I fall asleep, don't take it personally. Just wake me up and I will sort of continue. So what I'm presenting today is basically two parts. One part, the second part, is not a synopsis of the book, it's a glimpse of the book that I want to share with you. And the first part is in response to kind of the communication that I've had with you about, sort of the unit for criticism and interpretive theory. So it's the first time I'm presenting this, and so I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you and reactions you might have. So let me start. I feel greatly honored to speak at the University of Illinois in the unit for criticism and interpretive theory. As a historian of waiting, I even venture to say that I can hardly wait for our discussion. Thanks for being here. Still, when I received your kind invitation to give a lecture, I hesitated, I tarried, I dithered. After all, my scholarship operates on a scale different from meta-level theory. Let me therefore first explicate what, in taking up waiting as a theme today, I want to work out, before, in a second part, I give you tastes of some waiting in historical spaces filled with waiters. Parsing waiting in my research amounts to what I call meso-level analysis. I borrow this term from Joseph Gampel's exploration of intimate infrastructures. I don't know. It doesn't work, doesn't seem to work. Maybe it works here. Sorry. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it also doesn't work. That's interesting. Maybe this one? Oh, yeah, here we go. Thank you so much. Okay. So, meso-level analysis. I borrow this term from Joseph Gampel's exploration of intimate infrastructures in early modernity by the title of Sex Lives, just out with pen. Gampel's mesoizing, a term I coined to echo theorizing, is a response to, if not a reckoning with, the discontents regarding the imperative to theorize on a grand scale that has haunted his field, a field I know well, the history of sexuality. For Gampel, English Renaissance literature offers a heuristic not so much to explore the will to know, la volonté de savoir, which was the title of Michel Foucault's History of Sexuality in French and some other languages, but as the will to know how, that is the quest for guidance and instruction in the midst of competing social scripts and shifting anxieties about them. Allow me to posit that social scientists and scholars in the humanities have often focused on fixed concepts over attention to the fleeting, fluctuating, changing aspects of social life. And here's that word again, life. As expert narrators, we are, as a rule, chronographers or time tellers. We organize time through our inquiries and writings, and for the most part we do so implicitly, without explicating the temporizations we set in motion with our writing. Regularly relying on linear conceptions of time, we have refrained from calling attention to the ways we have timed our own accounts. And our temporized narrative have largely gone unacknowledged or unnoticed, unless they concern historical periods and periodization. Furthermore, we have favored outcomes and structures over processes. As a consequence, critics frequently have elided time-bound phenomena such as waiting and wait times from scholarly visibility. Yet scenarios of waiting with their opacities and uncertainties have had profound effects in shaping what we call events or structures. As such, waiting was and is imbricated with acts, plans, dreams, visions, fantasies, and wants. Waiting as a focus may therefore occasion a conception of scholarship in which these formative interim or meso-scenarios come to the fore and shine. Waiting is one temporal modality that makes time, according to the historical sociologist Norbert Elias, or Elias as you might say, time eludes the senses experiential. That makes time experiential. Waiting portions out the flow of time. Its temporal horizon has humans situate themselves in expectation of what is to come. For routine social interactions, such an expectation is predicated on a memory of similar experiences one has had or knows about. This strong anticipatory horizon sets waiting apart from other states of the mind, such as tarrying, hesitating, or dithering. It is a temporal modality tied to the prospect of a future conceived to be within reach. Waiting for something or someone is thus both situational and generative. Needless to say, how long and what we are waiting for shapes how waiters experience the time they spend during temporal in-betweens. It matters whether we wait for the birth of a child or the diagnosis of an unknown ailment, whether we are standing at a bus stop or go to work or longing to hear from a lover. A prisoner waits differently for his imminent release than an overworked employee for a long-awaited vacation. Waiting for the Messiah near the end of times is unlike waiting for a person's death to arrive. Still, all these experiences have something in common. No matter what one expects to occur, waiting can be said to be a bounded condition in which time becomes actual. The multiple forms of waiting notwithstanding, ordinary narratives about waiting are, as a rule, quite monochromatic. Waiting is frequently considered dead time, untime, or non-time. To some, this liminal state equals a state of deprivation, namely an inability to act on one's own accord, or a state of dependency, if not a temporal loss of subjectivity, a temporary loss of subjectivity. Precisely for this reason, waiting can be the most intense and poignant of all human experiences, as one critic, a theologian, has it. For social scientists, by contrast, waiting lacks ontological qualities. Rather than seeing it as indexical of the human condition per se, they interpret interstitial times as politically, socially, and culturally conditioned. Though waiting has to be tolerated individually, it actually forms an integral part of sociability. Whether the wait time one experiences is imposed or someone willingly subjects themselves to it, waiting enlists those who wait in its ranks. Waiters are removed from the activities that would fill their hours otherwise. Intermittent waiting reorients us toward other beings or infrastructures on whom we rely to end the state. In this sense, waiting's characteristics are about more than the strictures put in place by those in a position of power or authority. Rather, waiting is both an activity and an inactivity, a collective and an individual condition, sometimes simultaneously. And these dualities or complexities are, among other things, what makes it a temporal modality worthy of critical attention. Oh, here is a photograph on waiting that I wanted to show while talking about waiting in these general terms, and I'm happy to talk about it at some point because I know quite a bit about it. The iconography of waiting is not vast unless you have a way of looking into art that, sort of projects onto the viewer that they better remain in front of whatever it is, a sculpture, a painting, and so on. But this one is actually called Waiting, a German photographer of the early 50s. In one of the incunabula of the sociology of waiting, Barry Schwartz concluded in the mid-1970s that delays consistently shaped social interactions in the businesses, hospitals, publishing houses, and other institutions that he studied. While waiting for services and appointments was a pervasive phenomenon in the US, its organization, scripts, spaces, and social meanings eluded an analysis focused on cost or efficiency. Rather, social, cultural, psychological, racial, and similar scripts forge waiting scenarios. How people waited, the time spans they were made to wait, their willingness to wait, their discontent with having to wait, and so on, was contingent on race, class, gender, profession, religion, etc., in ways that, as Schwartz stated, required further study. In recent years, anthropologists have discovered multiple and complex forms of agency in waiting, the supposedly passive state, whether in welfare bureaucracies, among migrants, or regarding the and underemployed. And it's also interesting to look at the sort of panoply of different states where we have, considerable attention to waiting in anthropology or sociology. Argentina, Ethiopia, Georgia, Iran, South Africa, South Asia, etc. If we follow their findings, waiting's agency in societies across the globe is haphazard, momentary, and unstable, though undoubtedly present. In some, time, space, and their experience are not givens. They always are lived, and as a result, our descriptions benefit from striving to capture them in flux. Such processual granularity in scholarship is not without models, only that we have yet to become aware of such process-focused critical traditions. Let me give you an idea of what I have in mind for the amorphous canon I want to put together for this purpose and for tonight. You may think of other theoretical contributions to add to the list, and I'm very curious what you come up with if you're interested in pursuing this. As a battle cry for a restorative criticism, Raymond Williams' Structures of Feeling, the title of an essay by the cultural critic and humanist Marxist, countervail the reduction of the social to fixed forms, meanings, and values in sociocultural analysis in order to incite accounts with a focus on becoming and meaning-making. The gerund, feeling, in this case resonates with a variety of other concepts that have since received attention. Walking, for instance, invokes the French theorist Michel de Certeau, who contrasts seeing the city from an elevated panoramic position as a voyeur or concepteur to the city, as constituted and actively shaped by modes of walking. Such walking is irreducible to patterns or structures because walkers, as he says, elude discipline without being outside the field in which this discipline is exercised, and which should lead us to a theory of everyday practices, of lived spaces, of the disquieting familiarity of the city, unquote. There's actually a philosophy of walking that some of you might have come across that is quite commonly sold right now by another French philosopher, Frédéric Legros, and it's interesting when you look at the list of literature that he surveys in this very beautifully written book. Michel de Certeau actually doesn't come up. My third and final example is the art of noticing. This sensibility harks back to the influential anthropologist Anat Singh, who who in The Mushroom at the End of the World has us imagining surviving in our times of economic and ecological ruination. Neither Tales of Progress nor of Ruin tell us how to think about collaborative survival. It is time to pay attention to mushroom picking, and that is what she does. And if those of you who know this book will know that the new ways of telling true stories, Tsing practices, amount to what she calls a riot of short chapters, which she compares to the flushes of mushrooms that come up after a rain, and not the substantial chapters we often get to read. Writing and waiting and reading and listening could be added to the concepts such as feeling, walking, and noticing. And there might be many others. One may connect this motley collage of critical approaches that tend to processes of meaning-making with the impact of the so-called performative turn in the 1980s, Victor Turner and others. Yet keep in mind that when I deploy terms such as process and the processual, I'm not referring to phenomena we observe as outside of ourselves, but as ways of entangling subjects and objects in tentative and open-ended ways. And just to invoke this, I have, projected here an image of an artist that I got to know, not personally, but through an exhibition in Helsinki this past summer. He is Catalonian and Brazilian and is one who helps us rethink the nature as object, but rather makes us be part of the settings that we are experiencing in this exhibition. What you see here is a very simple thing, supposedly, or at the first level, namely a cut-up twig that he picked up in Brazil at some point and cut into two halves, thereby creating a sculpture. But that sculpture is mounted through these strings. And so when you enter the space, you actually have a direct impact and you feel your impact. And his whole art is about questioning that border that we construct between us and what we observe. To sum up, meso-level analysis tarry in and piece apart the circuits and exchanges that connect up the very small, the micro, with the very big, macro, a sort of analytic foreplay that indefinitely suspends the spectacular release of macro-level claims in the hopes of inventing other, more contingent forms of meaning-making for groups of people. To pick an aspect for the effective scenarios that this middling analysis may allow us to see, waiting triggers effective responses in waiters. Joyful anticipation, anxious reflection, bored indifference, fledgling tedium, and so on. Why confront the cluster of feelings and states of the mind or the body that waiting unleashes in those who wait? To answer this question, I turn to Vincent Crapanzano, an anthropologist who, planning to study the effects of domination on everyday life in South Africa under apartheid, book published in 1985, instead arrived at writing about white South Africans whose waiting shaped their lives. And I will read from his beautifully written introduction. To talk about dread, angst, guilt, or being overwhelmed, all of which are components of the experience of waiting, adds a metaphysical dimension, a melodramatic tension, to the very ordinary experience I'm trying to describe. Such terms elevate the experience. They give it importance. They permit a sort of moral indulgence, a taking comfort in it. Symptoms of the ordinary, they mask the ordinary. It is precisely this masking that has to be avoided. Waiting, in this case, the South African experience, must be appreciated in all of its banality. Therein lies its pity and its humanity, unquote. Through the lens of waiting may now be a good moment to embark on reconceiving another big T, time with a capital letter. In recent decades, and this actually goes back to at least the mid-century, In recent decades, historians, social scientists, and cultural critics of various tribes have started to stress that time is not one. They speak of varieties of temporal experience, temporal complexity, heterochronicity, plurality, or pluritemporality. Others deploy the expression multiplicity, if not diversity of times. Yet others have coined descriptions such as plenitude, fullness, or thickness of time, translating the multi-layeredness of the temporal dimension into particular religious, cultural, political, disciplinary, and period-specific frames of understanding. However, the multiple times they investigate in a variety of contexts are, for the most part, external to the selves. What has found little attention in the feverishly expanding historiography on time and temporality are inward notations of time, to cite E.P. Thompson. And here is the famous article. It's actually the most downloaded historical article. It was at least a couple of years ago. For early moderns, those that I'm concerned about, and E.P. Thompson in this article on the late 18th, early 19th centuries also. For early moderns, time, including waiting, qualified as a force to be drawn on, mulled over, and used. That is, used individually and inwardly. Acting in time required not only attention to time's rhythms, but also thought, forethought, and attentiveness. Such temporal agency oriented individuals toward the future. This practical take is one of the foundations for the fascination with time that permeated early modern European culture. Temporal awareness, in short, was a strategic tool and was meant to assist individuals in their tribulations, whatever they were. And it's very interesting that right now in philosophy, I'm thinking here of a work an article by Christina Sampson that just came out maybe in 2018 or 19, sort of go back to what they call the Baroque and create a notion of our time as a neo-Baroque, in which these uncertainties become very much part of their thinking. And in this particular case, her sort of hero is Balthasar Gracian, this author, Jesuit author of a guide to prudence, to prudent behavior that was very popular in the 17th, 18th, but also in modernity. Waiting may thus provide a paradoxical, powerful, and prolific guide to social relations and their history on a meso level. What is more, waiting is something of an antidote against what sometimes has been called the temporal turn, with its exclusive focus on the temporal dimension. The intersection of the temporal and the visual spatial form the basis of the word waiting. Its root combines the semantic layers of to watch, therefore visual, spatial, and to lie in wait for, the temporal. In medieval English and German, the word conjures up, turning one's watchful eye to the perils on the horizon. As a temporal spatial condition, waiting provides those who wait with the opportunity to prepare for what is or may be coming their way. If we are on guard, in other words, we can be ready for those who approach us. Being alert in this fashion entails imagining the immediate future with a tense anticipation. Who are the persons moving toward the watchful observers and those who wait? What kind of encounter will ensue? So let me precisely take this thinking about combining the visual spatial with the temporal to a particular setting to think through the implications of what I just outlined. Can you hear me okay? Is that, yeah? This nexus of space and time runs deep in architecture. We are unable to map a building in its entirety. Rather, we unlock built spaces in and through time. While often unacknowledged, these movements and rhythms are part of architecture's presence. That we experience buildings in a gradual manner is particularly palpable in anti-spaces. What you see here is the Upper Belvedere, which is a chateau or castle in or near Vienna in the 18th century, where the facade, the main facade of the upper part of this enormous park and structures, two structures, is sort of shown between the clouds and the reflection in the pool with the main gate showing. And here we have what you would have had to walk in. You would likely not have been let in through the main gate, but through a side gate to the facade and to the staircase that would lead you up to where we are ending right now, namely the antechamber. These are illustrations or prints by an exceptional artist of the 18th century, Salomon Kleiner, who was working on Vedute in mostly Vienna and other places at the time, and did a multi-volume series on the Upper Belvedere as this example of everything that architecture could be at that moment. That we experience buildings in a gradual manner is particularly palpable in antespaces, those chambers that lead to the chief apartment, according to an 18th century dictionary. In these rooms before ante, other rooms, mobility and immobility converge. Tellingly, the prefix ante or before has a spatial and a temporal register. One traverses spaces to come to a halt in a place designated for those who wait for an encounter. Anterooms are transitional, symbolic, and functional. They are located in between, they anchor social relations, and they invite signification. This confluence of spatial, temporal, and social parameters within the walls of a room is why the antechamber has been singled out as the architectural locus par excellence for pre-modern societies. Norbert Elias, it's the same sociologist but in different work, proposes as much in his influential study of aristocratic culture. This room, he says, the antechamber, is the symbol of good court society in the Ancien Régime, the old regime. According to the historical sociologist, the rooms where domestics waited to wait on their masters or others waited to interact with people in residence encapsulates the coexistence of constant spatial proximity and constant social distance, of intimate contact in one stratum and the strictest aloofness in the other, a statement Elias highlighted by italicizing it. How to design a space to house people for a while? How to make waiters realize who they are in relation to those whose thresholds they crossed? How to ease their plight or occupy their minds? In early modern Europe, anti-structures were endowed with messages about the owners or occupants. Their adornments often spoke of lineage, wealth, status, or distinction. Yet these interiors with their furnishings and seating arrangements also shaped social interactions. They solicited responses, guided people, and encouraged certain comportments among those who passed through them. Tellingly, the rendering of the Italian Antechamber as Antechamber in French suggests a contrast. The spelling of ante, or before, as anti, or against, entered the vocabulary of many European languages, including English. In the 18th century, Samuel Johnson bemoaned that the term is, he writes, generally written improperly or corruptly, namely as anti. Such antechambres, or antechambers, conjured up visions of a world of luxuries beyond the closed doors the waiters were hoping to see open. Thus viewed, the antechamber is a room defined by its relation to other rooms. A space designated as such forms part of a sequence of two or more rooms separated by walls. This is not what I want. Such a space orders the flow of people in multi-room edifices, protecting residents from unwanted intrusions, as well as allowing them or their staff to control visitors' access to a building's inner quarters. In Europe, rooms defined as transitory both spatially and temporally first emerged in palaces of the late medieval period. And here's where this example comes from. This is the papal palace in Avignon, where when the papacy was in exile from Rome, they occupied a bishop's palace with its 4 wings around a central courtyard, to which under Benedict XIII, in the middle of the 14th century, these chambers were added that were where the sort of Pope retreated. His innermost chambers, where he slept, had conversations with intimates. But there are 2 rooms that separate and distance these busy quarters from the living and residential quarters. And this is where people would have waited, and officers in charge would have mediated encounters with the Pope that could have taken place here in the space or even in the inner quarters themselves. But this is not about a first, and I'm not claiming that this is a first. It's just one example that is very well documented, and that's why I'm introducing it here. Such spaces then appeared in 16th century royal residences and emerged as a standard feature of the dwellings of the elite and of the middling classes in the 17th and 18th century. Once the antechamber emerged in the residences of the powerful, it was only logical in a stratified society their number multiplied to distinguish between visitors of different status. The closer the antechamber is to the apartment of the ruler, the more magnificent the furnishings, is how an 18th century writer synthesized these practices. And this is precisely what you see here. You see the wing in the Upper Belvedere in Vienna and the Bel Etage. You see the antechamber again. And the conference room could also serve as a second antechamber. And when you just have your eyes glance over these 3, you see how, kind of a simpler decoration gives way to more complexity of art furnishings and other parameters. And Salomon Kleiner, this really fantastic artist, has filled these spaces not with actual people, but with props, I think. For these reasons and more, anterooms offer a supreme vantage point from which to explore the intersection of architecture, time, and sociality. Those rooms are what we have, and their spatial logic has much to tell us about the moments of containment and coercion they helped shape. Such an anticameral focus permits us to invert approaches to the study of buildings that favor the most luxuriously furnished spaces. It's also where modern tourists, they're often guided through these lesser ornamented spaces directly into the more ornamented, whereas you, as a waiter or as a visitor in the 18th century in this case, would have been stuck there and maybe never advanced. Studying antispatiality also means reversing a common focus on festive rituals by refocusing on seemingly mundane interactions between unequals. These rooms' time-space infrastructure has therefore much to tell us. The following examples, which I will do very, very quickly, stake out a spectrum of decorative possibilities: lessons, histories, and entertainment. The antispaces I selected exemplify courts of different stature, a tiny residence, a residence in small territory, and one of Europe's eminent courts. The owners were different also: a well-educated prince, a woman consort of royal descent, and a philosopher king. Well, that's how he saw himself anyway. And with this first example, I want to give thanks to Mara, who helped me decode and read it. But I had to condense what I learned from you. This is Pyrmont. For people willing or able to engage the multilingual emblems on the wainscots in this anteroom from the early 18th century, the space you see constituted a forum where virtue, fate, and ingenuity figure among the cues. The time to act, it is suggested, may be near. Always forward or never backwards. Jamais indietro. One emblem signaled. An emblem is a verbal visual motto created to provoke reflection or discussion. Is that something one could say, Mara?
One could say.
Okay, thank you. This image text is adequately positioned next to the door to the festive hall with an open landscape and a sun as a pictura or image. From the sala, one would have looked out over the garden. And by the way, if you like this wallpaper, it's modern. It's meant to invoke sort of what was there in the 18th century but can't be reconstructed. This Anteroom's anthology of emblems construed people as individuals in the flow of time, encouraging them to weigh their options at every turn, even under adverse circumstances, and to act with foresight, everyone by and for themselves. In general, the space where one possibly spends some time showcases a temporal sensibility centered on occasions, those constellations in time that are thick with the promise to change one's lot to the better. The belief that one ought to plan one's every move stood at the center of this emblematic community in the summer residence of the Counts of Waldeck-Pyrmont, and arguably of early modern court life in general. Second example. In early modern Europe, aristocratic culture was constituted by shared horizons. Cultural exchange, as well as competition among different courts, stood at its core. With its tapestry of territories, this dynamic of connection and differentiation was particularly vibrant in the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation. The rooms at the Hermitage or Hermitage near Bayreuth were of modest size, yet exquisitely furnished. The mid-18th century decor subtly invokes the person who designed them, Wilhelmine of Bayreuth. The colors black and silver in the anteroom of her apartment allude to Prussia's coat of arms, reminding visitors of her dynastic lineage as a Hohenzollern princess. This chamber's somber coloration contrasts with the audience room's friendly chromaticism. There are carved crown, takes up the theme of royal blood. In her apartment, the Margravine was a presence, that was her title, whether she herself was in residence or not. Tellingly, her initial appears above the antechamber's doorway. One of her companions, a dog named Folichon, can be seen, if not heard, in a ceiling painting on the theme of an ancient wife and heroine. And here's Folichon. I don't do the barking. Do you want me to bark? Can someone do the barking? Wilhelmine carefully curated her courtly selfhood. The self-fashioning includes motifs such as social stature, great women, and moral exemplarity, as you see in this painting. Historical facts represent virtues, she states in her memoirs, of course in French. Accordingly, the audience room in her husband's wing, which he also designed, features Themistocles before the Persian king. And that is what you see here. Artaxerxes, on top of those stairs on his throne, appears on a throne atop steep stairs, surrounded by a great many courtiers in orientalized costumes. As Plutarch tells the story, the military leader and Athenian politician who had once masterminded the defeat of the Persians fled to Persia after having fallen out of favor in his native Athens. Here, he is portrayed as a mere supplicant on a quest for a post. His daring but well-planned moves at a court whose foreign customs made his success unlikely granted him a position by favor of the king and against the will of the courtiers. Occasion. Encountering a ruler is replete with possibilities for the savvy who play their cards right, or so it is suggested. There's little evidence that this was the rule in the courts of early modern Europe. The potential to seize the moment to one's advantage may have been an intriguing discourse to entertain in courtly settings. This idea must have tickled potentates by holding those waiting for an interaction accountable for the outcomes they failed or succeeded to achieve. Still, this and other paintings also served as a reminder to those in power to make such reversals possible through their acts. So it's also an appeal to them. Be that as it may, the asymmetrical distribution of power in waiting scenarios runs through these depictions. As we have seen, different impulses were at work in decorating antechambers during the 18th century. On the one hand, the antechamber was a place to impart information or impress, if not instruct or intimidate the visitor. On the other hand, pictorial strategies revolved around keeping those stuck there engaged, as with the emblems chosen for Prümont Castle. In Charlottenburg, near Berlin, now it is part of Berlin, the painted decor of the first antechamber to the young Prussian king's new apartment functioned in yet another way. It was as if the walls of the stuffy space gave way to a veranda from where one strolls into a garden. And the garden actually is located in the same direction as these paintings are, the actual landscape garden behind the chateau. Consequently, the room resembled a threshold between inside and outside, an in-betweenness that mirrored the antechamber's function as a gate to other rooms. Those present would not merely have been observers. Given the fresco's scale, they became actors in a tableau vivant. Interestingly, these scenes exude not a whiff of busyness, military service, or political intrigue, nor are there mythological pretensions. While lifelike, the figures are no portraits. What waiters become part of were gallant pleasantries in the here and now. In the 18th century, I cannot be held responsible for these depictions. I apologize. It's a little bit like elevator, paintings. But they're really interesting to work with. In the 18th century, such depictions had decidedly French overtones. Not accidentally, the painter whose studio invented these scenes, Antoine Pen, hailed from France. One could and can see this cultural artistic orientation in political terms as a manifesto of anti-Habsburg leanings. Be that as it may, the painted scenes propel waiters into the midst of a costume ball or a festive gathering. The decoration in this room before another and yet another one has us believe that life's fulfillment seem imminent, all this in light of the likely wait times associated with antispaces. However, let's remember that love as a code has an intimate relationship with time. Lovers love to wait, lovers hate to wait. In other words, courtly love was a discipline about timing one's action for the due moment to be with one's secret beloved, not unlike the occasionalism we encountered. In sum, the patrons and designers of palatial buildings drew on various iconographic settings for antispaces. Ideally, the antecameral imageries honored the space's master or mistress. A field marshal like Prince Eugene of Savoy, who commissioned the Upper Belvedere, the consort of an aristocrat, or a person of royal lineage conjured up different iconographic horizons. These reflexes were rarely unequivocal. They lent themselves to be discovered, decoded, and debated, processes that absorb time. What about those who roamed these rooms, the waiters? According to an 18th century observer, the waiting room in the Hofburg, the principal Habsburg residence in Vienna, was a space where different stations and ranks commingled. It is said, the high and mighty become lowly here. The princes, counts, and lords mix with the lowliest nobles, officers, scribes, and all kinds of people. Allerhand Menschen. Indeed, when confined to a room with many other waiters, social distinction was difficult to maintain. The Stuttgart Court Ordinance of 1730 speaks of confusions and disorders that arise as a result. In an attempt to fix the social order spatially, emperors issued ordinances that determined who had access to which parts of the imperial apartments. These efforts notwithstanding, the pyramid of ranks and offices never aligned with the courtly hustle and bustle or the exigencies of the everyday. Confusion persisted. This is one of these waiting spaces in the Hofburg that makes it look much more magnificent than it actually was. So the Hofburg was a building that was changed over centuries and never quite made it to be as beautiful as the Prince Eugene of Savoy, their general, if you will. But here you see one of these festive occasions that supposedly took place there. The spatial configuration of a residence with its sequence of rooms and the various apartments thus shaped how the protocol unfolded and people moved through them. To those involved, these details mattered, from the timing of the encounter to the welcoming ritual, individual gestures, seating accommodations, and so on. Especially during an official visit, these signs may have been more important than what was spoken. In early modern Europe, an audience did not suggest the formal qualities we often associate with the term. The word covered a range of encounters, from a highly ritualized or scripted interaction to the casual. There were ceremonies that welcomed ambassadors, dignitaries, and high-ranking aristocrats. But there also were times when rulers offered ordinary subjects and travelers the chance to meet them. During regular visiting hours, waiters in the antechamber hoped to be singled out. One emperor was known to grant preferential access to foreigners and clerics. Others frequently waited in vain, as a French journalist noted. According to this commentator, there was no scarcity of opportunities. Emperor Leopold was in the habit of holding several visiting hours 2 or 3 times a week when in town. If we follow this account, the names of waiters on a given day were collected on a list from which the emperor picked those he wanted to speak to. For his part, Leopold was loquacious and, like many of his successors or predecessors. Given the length of the conversations, only 3 or 4 waiters usually made it to the imperial chamber on a given day. Delays and deferments were the consequence. After repeatedly having waited, a military officer in the imperial army lost his patience. While the sovereign conversed with an ecclesiastical dignitary, he expressed frustration loudly for everyone to hear, including his ruler. Emperor, call in your officers who die for you, not the clerics who tell you tall tales. He said that in Italian, which was one of the spoken languages, but I regale you with not speaking in Italian, because my Italian is heavily accented. Occasionally, waiters were unruly. They brought their own tabourets, little stools. They knocked on doors when they were told not to. They made noises that could be heard in adjacent rooms. Their laughter made it into the record. Some pilfered the contents of pieces of furniture within their reach. Others even left a mark of their stay in the form of graffiti. Okay, so we are, coming to. I was going to talk about one example of one traveler who was actually quite successful in the antechamber because he prepared. He is a. Here is the Hofburg, but here is a formal occasion, and you see the attention that is given by this artist, unlike Solomon Kleiner, not so much about the decor, but about the arrangement of people. Here's an audience with the emperor. An audience with the emperor was followed with an audience with the empress, and she had always her ladies-in-waiting in place. And this these 2 works of art by Saxon based artist documented a visit by a Saxon dignitary or son of a king did document what happened. Here is our Karl Moser. It's a very flattering portrait. I chose the most flattering one, and in which he describes what happened in the antechamber. And he was, because he put a lot of effort into it, successful. And the antechamber in this case evolves as a semi-public space in which you were observed and you observed. It was a part of an education of someone who, like him, when he was in the antechamber, he was 20. Here, of course, is a portrait at a later time. So that was part of his education. And he was picked up as a talented jurist or lawyer and would have been given a position if he had converted to Catholicism, which he did not want to do. But let me come to the end so we have plenty of time for discussion. Anti-spaces in early modern Europe reflected a social, political, and cultural order centered on the elites, especially the aristocracy, and their residences as centers of social, political, and cultural life. Those knowledgeable, privileged, or well-dressed enough to get to the anteroom were given an architectural space in which to linger. They often were accorded certain days and hours to appear, and they were kept at bay waiting while seeking to advance whatever cause they had come for. The antechamber provided a forum where the principle of elite approachability met the sobering realities on the ground. Its rituals were part and parcel of the production of power and authority. Put differently, the antechamber was not simply an expression of a predetermined power dynamic. It was an agent in social intercourse, the object of anticipatory steps and fantasies under the signum of uncertain outcomes. The opacity associated with such irregular, momentary, and deferred interactions was the other side of the occasionalist philosophy that grounded one's life in time as action-bound. But acting in time was not only about transactions or outcomes. It was about exhibiting connections that were meaningful in and of themselves. Those who made it into these spaces, it is safe to say, were already privileged in that they possessed the ability to possibly become participants in an encounter. And they showed that to others in the waiting room. Waiting in the antechambers of old regime Europe thus revolved around the conundrum of mutual obligations in societies marked by inequalities. As participants in asymmetrical scripts, waiters and those who had people wait co-produced authority, power, and social distinction. Yet the presence of waiters in the antechamber, divided only by walls and doors from those above their station, also entailed the potential for disrupting courtly routines. For foregrounding, the temporal modality of waiting means to say no to discarding waiting episodes as lost time. As an evanescent yet semantically rich, emotionally and semantically rich mode, waiting has the potential to remind social scientists and scholars in the humanities of who they may become. With one hand on a tree trunk and the other akimbo, the waiter's arc reflects a bodily tension. You see him right here. With their hesitant openness, to quote Siegfried Kracauer, those who wait offer a model for the historian, alert, attentive, and while seemingly ready to become active immobile, ready to become active at any moment. Thank you for listening. And